Hey friends, this is Professor Ross. In this video, we're going to be talking about cautions when we use inference. So anytime we use an inferential procedure like a hypothesis test or calculated confidence interval, there are a number of things to be aware of and to be cautious about as we carry out these tests. Um, if you're inexperienced with statistics or less careful, you tend to not pay attention to these things. So I want all of my students to have a chance to think about them and to always consider these aspects whenever they're carrying out statistical procedures and specifically inferential procedures. One of our main learning objectives with this lesson is to distinguish between statistical significance and practical significance. And I'll just say a comment up front. Uh, we have mainly focused on statistical significance up to this point in the course. When we run a hypothesis test, or if we get some information from a confidence interval, we might say we found statistically significant results. That doesn't always mean that the difference that we found, the statistically significant difference, is something that would actually matter or be perceptible in the scenario or the day-to-day living. And that's what practical significance is about. Is this something that's going to actually have much of an impact? Is it something we would notice? And so we want to focus on those two ideas as we think about these things. And we'll talk about them quite a bit with every study we take a look at from here on out. That's something you should think about. If I found statistically significant results, is it still something practically significant, something we'd notice, take note of, or would have an impact in the day-to-day situation? All right. One of the cautions you need to know about is social desirability bias. And one specific aspect of that is called the Bradley effect, named after a situation that happened in the early 1980s in California. So there was an election for the governor of California in 1982. Early polls showed that Bradley was in the lead and consistently maintained the lead in the polls leading up to the election. But there were many undecided. At the actual election, Bradley actually ended up losing the election and lost somewhat narrowly. Here's what happened. Bradley was African American and his opponent was white. Many people believe that what was going on was the undecided voters didn't want to sound racially biased to pollsters. So when asked by pollsters, are you going to vote for Bradley or for the white candidate? Instead of saying, I'm going to vote for the white candidate, they simply said, oh, I haven't decided yet. So this social desirability bias, they didn't want to look bad. And so they avoided telling pollsters that they were going to vote against the African American. And in the end, when they had the ability to cast their vote anonymously, that was when the truth came out. So that's called the Bradley effect, when we have people who are avoiding revealing what they really feel or have really decided, particularly to avoid some kind of social faux pas or looking bad in front of others. So this social desirability bias is certainly something that we want to keep in mind whenever we are trying to gather data from people. Any sensitive topic could cause responders to not be completely open and honest. One example is oftentimes students on campus, if they're doing like a stats project, they might want to find out about GPA. And if you ask face to face another student what their GPA is, that might be a sensitive topic. That other student might want to avoid looking bad and might not be totally honest if they have a low GPA or lower than what they wished it was. That's one example. We could probably think of many, many examples where respondents might be a little bit hesitant to be fully open because of this social desirability bias. Definitely something to think about as you design your own studies, and also to think critically about as you listen to results from other studies. Another area where we might see some issues with statistical inference, weakness in some random sampling processes. So we've said generally, if you've got a random sample, things are good. If you have a non-random sample, things are not so good. But even sometimes random sampling, even if there are aspects of randomness to it, cannot be handled fully well. So the very best is when we can get a list of everyone and give everyone an equal chance of getting into our sample. That's a simple random sample. But sometimes if we can't do that, we still try to include randomness. One thing we want to try to avoid is what's called underrepresentation. When we have some group of individuals that, even though we're trying to do a random process, that group might not be represented in our sample very well. For example, a lot of polling in the US has used random digit dialing, just calling random phone numbers, especially political polls, to try to find out what people want or are interested in politically or are thinking, but it underrepresents people without phones. And you might think, off the top of your head, you're like, well, everybody's got a phone, right? But there are certain elements of the population that may have less access to phones or may just simply not have phones. We may be underrepresenting, for example, the homeless population or others in poverty who have less ability and less access to phones. Another aspect of this random digit dialing that has really come up over the last few years, and many think it was a big part of the 2016 presidential election where Trump won somewhat unexpectedly. A lot of people now have caller ID on their cell phones and simply won't answer the phone if it's not a number they know. And so you're certainly cutting out a certain portion of the population if you're trying to randomly dial people and you're getting certain people that just simply aren't answering the phone. So that's some issues there, even if you're trying to do it randomly. Here's another one that might show underrepresentation of trying to sample students here on campus, a random selection of people in line for lunch at Pearson's. So the cafeteria on campus, who might be underrepresented? Well, maybe commuter students who don't have meal plans and don't eat at Pearson's. And so they might not be represented in your sample in an appropriate way. So we got to be really careful about that. We want the very best we can to have as much of our total population into our random selection as possible. Another huge issue when sampling is poor response rate. So this response rate is simply the number of people that you actually get information from out of the total that you have selected for your sample. So for example, maybe you do a random selection of 200 students. You get the list of all Maryville College students from the registrar. You randomly select 200 of them for your sample. Wonderful, right? You got the list, you did the right random process. You try to contact them and get their academic information in a survey, but you only get 32 to respond. The response rate there is 32 out of 200, which whatever percent that is, that's pretty low, right? It's well below 50%. That's more like 10 or 15% there. Um, that's not good. In fact, your random sample is really not what you're basing your results on. You're basing it on only these 32. Even though the random selection was good, it's not what ends up being the foundation of your statistics. What you ended up with was 32 volunteers. Out of these 200 students, 32 of them volunteered and said, "Okay, I'll do this." And it's very possible that many of those who did not respond, of those 200, there's something consistently different from them from the 32 volunteers who actually did respond. Maybe the 32 that responded were proud of their academic information and happy to share it with you, whereas maybe 30, 40, 50, 100 of the others were less excited about sharing their academic information because maybe it wasn't as good. Certainly, you can see how that would introduce bias into the problem. Essentially, if you have a poor response rate, you are no longer getting the benefits of the random selection and you are getting what's called voluntary response, which is, sad face here, not not good. Usually voluntary response means there's something about the people who are willing and volunteering to give their information that's consistently different from the ones who are not. So poor response rate changes a random sample to a voluntary response sample, and then it removes our belief that the sample is representative of the population. It's probably biased. All right, so those are a couple of sampling issues that you definitely need to be aware of and thinking about. We also have issues that are not connected to sampling. We call these non-random or systematic errors. These kinds of problems would affect your results even if you did a perfect random sample, or if you did a perfect census. You got data from every single person. If there were these kinds of systematic errors, they would still cause problems in your data. So, a couple things to be aware of. We as humans simply have trouble remembering details accurately. So, some of the studies that have been done with juries and trying to see if juries can accurately, excuse me, not juries, witnesses in jury trials, seeing how well witnesses can remember details. It's actually kind of horrifying to find out how much uh, eyewitness accounts can be off from what reality was. Um, so if you're trying to survey someone and find out what the details are of something from that happened in the past, it can be hard to rely on details accurately. Respondents also sometimes say one thing, but then they do or they think another. So we saw this for certain to a certain degree in the Bradley election, where respondents said, "Well, I'm undecided," but they really knew in their mind they were going to vote against Bradley. Um, this kind of thing can happen. Political polls happen months and months before the election, and then voters change their minds, right? And that kind of thing just happens a lot. So something else to just be aware of, that this might be happening. So we might have misremembering happening, or people changing their mind. Sometimes it's a problem with the way you create the survey, and this is when you can control and try to be careful for. If you have poor or confusing wording on your questions in a survey, that can really make your data worth a lot less. So, for example, including double negatives in questions or things like that, where the reader just doesn't understand what they're supposed to be saying, or thinks it means something different than what you thought, and you don't get results that are helpful to you. One way you can try to avoid this is with what's called a pilot. So you take your survey and you give it to a few people, and you do a lot of asking them, "What did this make you think of? Did this mean this to you? Was anything confusing?" And try to iron out any of those problems before you use the survey broadly. Can make a big impact on improving that. Sometimes this can be used in a unethical way, perhaps, using extreme wording on questions. So, an example: could you ever possibly even consider going so far as supporting a ban on smoking in restaurants? Back when they used to let people smoke in restaurants, and restaurants were trying to decide, should we ban this or not? Could you ever even possibly consider it? So it's really pushing toward one answer. Whoa, not me! I would never do that, because it sounds so extreme, right? Um, so sometimes polls are like that. If you see these things popping up on the internet while you're browsing around or whatever, or maybe you're listening to some radio program where the wording is kind of made in an extreme way, and it kind of influences you to think or answer in one way, not so great. We also have effects of the interviewer, and there's some great kind of classic uh, analyses of these things from a few decades ago, at least, where a lot of times psychological research was done, and the researchers would have the white lab coats on, and would be kind of intimidating and impressive, maybe in some way, and that would influence how people would think and respond in these studies. So, but you can go the other way as well. If your interviewer is like too casual and laid back, that might influence them another way. So it can be really hard to balance this. But basically, you want to try to be as neutral as possible when interviewing, and let people feel comfortable and open and honest as much as possible. Here's a silly example. Let's say this guy asked you whether you support a ban on facial hair. Clearly, you'd have a hard time looking at this guy and saying, "Oh, I hate facial hair," right? So, um, anyway, that's something to think about when you're doing an interview or a survey. You don't want to influence your folks taking the survey in any way, so you want to try to be as neutral as you can. Another really important issue, and this is the one I highlighted at the beginning, there's a difference between statistical significance and what we call practical importance, or practical significance, or a meaningful difference is another phrase I'll use sometimes. So, what are we talking about here? We can get something that calculates to be a statistically significant difference. And in other words, we feel there's a high probability that there's a difference between what we saw or was going on versus what the hypothesis claimed. But the issue is that that difference does not have to be a very big difference for that calculation to turn out to be significant, statistically significant. It might be a very, very tiny difference between what we saw and the hypothesis claim that actually turns out statistically significant, but it's such a tiny difference, it's not practically different. This happens especially when we have samples that are huge. And we've talked a lot about the benefits of big samples in the past. And oftentimes we want to gather as large of a sample as we can. But the bigger your sample is, the more you need to pay attention to this idea. And really, anytime you do any kind of hypothesis testing or claiming from maybe a confidence interval that something is different, it's super important to be thinking about this question. In fact, it's one of the key 5 learning objectives for the course, and one that I hope you walk away with understanding and thinking about whenever you engage with statistics. Here's an example. Let's say they were testing new cell phone batteries to see if they had better life, right? Better length of time that they charged the phones for. And let's say they tested 10,000 new cell phone batteries and found a statistically significant result. They rejected the null hypothesis that the batteries are no different, and they found out that the new cell phone batteries have 2 minutes longer life. And they might plaster all over all over the ads for the batteries or the boxes or whatever, like, this battery is statistically significantly lasts longer than the old batteries. But real honestly, I mean, if your phone lasted 2 minutes longer than it used to, is that something you're going to notice? In day-to-day living, we'd never notice the 2-minute difference. So it's somewhat misleading to emphasize the statistically significant result and not talk about if there's any practical importance, right? Now, if you put on there and you say these batteries last 2 minutes longer than the old one, then people can kind of judge that fairly. But if all you do is try to use the statistically significant claim to impress people, that's no good. Is it unimportant that they're statistically significantly different? No, we actually found they really do have a different battery life. They're not the same. They're not shorter than the old batteries. They are longer. The only thing is they're not practically in a real way. Really, that difference is not really doing much for us in a day-to-day experience. So that's the heart of the idea. We can have statistical significance, but that doesn't mean we have a practically significant or practically important result. As I mentioned, large samples tend to cause problems with this because they have so much power to detect tiny differences that that sometimes we can find this happening. So we got to be careful, especially with large samples. A key idea is that the p-value, or if you're looking at standardized statistic, that establishes statistical significance. But the p-value does not tell us about practical importance. We can't tell, is this difference important in a day-to-day way by looking at a p-value or a standardized statistic. The best way to do it is to look at confidence intervals. So this is why we like using both of these inferential tools together. A confidence interval helps us understand how much different is it, right? If we just said, if we hadn't put this in here, we might not understand at all how much better the new batteries are. But if we do a confidence interval and find out we have, 2 minutes or an interval of values, maybe 1.5 to 2.5 minutes longer, that confidence interval around how much different is it can be a really key thing to understanding practical importance. So if you're looking to understand how practically different or how meaningful that different is, examine the confidence interval, especially the low end of the confidence interval, and that tells you, well, it's at least this different. And that's a really key thing. And we'll try that out with a lot of the studies we look at from on out here. Another key idea is the power of the test. So the power of a significance test is the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when it's false. This is what we want to do. We want to reject the null when it's false. higher power tests are good. Unfortunately, low power tests tend to stick with the null hypothesis too frequently, which means we're missing opportunities. And unfortunately, low power tests happen too frequently. The main thing they happen from is small samples. So if you don't have a ton of resources to put into getting a large sample, then you might end up with missed opportunities. And that might mean you might have an interesting idea and it might actually have some kind of meaningful thing out there in reality, and your test was too low power to actually identify that and help you know, find that out. So one of the key things is to try to get a sense of how powerful is your test. Is it good enough to give you, you know, to help you do the work meaningfully? And how can we get more power? Biggest way is larger samples. But we're going to find out with all of these, there's a trade-off. So you can do larger samples, but they take more time, effort, and resources to get uh, a properly gathered large sample with true randomness. So you got to be willing to put in those things to get a larger sample. Another way to get more power is to use a higher significance level alpha. We've almost always talked about alpha being 0.05. You could raise it to 0.10, 10%. That would give you a more powerful test. But there's a trade-off. 10% alpha means 10% chance of a type 1 error. So you're doubling your chance of an error if you reject the null hypothesis. So that's a trade-off that many people are not willing to make. The other, you get more power from an alternative farther from pi. So if your null hypothesis claim is one thing, and you say, hey, I will look for a difference that's this far away, um, that that can give your test more power. It's connected to this meaningful or practical difference. How small of a practical difference do you need to have? If it's bigger, you get more power, but then you can't really tell the fine grained differences between your results and a null hypothesis. So all these have different trade-offs. The main thing for you to take away from this is, well, let's make sure we get as large a sample as we can to make our test as powerful as we can. All right, so those are a number of the issues that you want to be aware of whenever you're dealing with statistical inference. And I want to highlight again, especially always be thinking about if I have statistically significant results and the difference between that and practically important or practically significant results.